In the not-for-profit world, there are a few towering giants. While the corporate world has Coke, Nike and McDonald's, the not-for-profit world has the Vinnies. And at the top of that iconic organisation sits Dr. John Falzon. John came to my particular attention just recently with the publication of his book, The Language of the Unheard. And there's actually a sheet, if you want to order that book, I recommend we should get sort of 750 books sold here today, I think. It was like Communities in Control, The Notion, but in a jam-packed book. And I knew we had to get him for the conference, and of course we used Joe to do that. John is the Chief Executive of the St Vincent de Paul Society National Council of Australia. He's written and spoken widely on the structural causes of inequality and has a long history of advocacy for a fairer Australia. John has degrees in literature, he's a published poet, theology, philosophy, politics and social analysis. He participated in the 2020 summit, has served on the ACOS board and is a member of the Australian Social Inclusion Board. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here this afternoon. It's a great pleasure and a privilege. We're discussing social justice on Aboriginal land that was unjustly taken from a people who were and continue to be unjustly subjected to the crime of colonisation. I pay my respects to the traditional owners and the custodians of this land and to the spirit of collective resistance, collective dreaming and collective hope. Because I've got the pulpit, I get to be really self-indulgent now and tell whatever stories I like. So I'm going to begin with a story from my family. A few years ago, I should preface the story by saying that my partner and I are very strict religious devotees of the teachings of Mark Latham. We always read to our children at night. So this particular night a few years ago, my son Gian, who was probably about 8 or 9 at the time, he didn't want me to read to him, he didn't want to read to me this particular night, but he wanted us to just lie next to each other on his bed and read our respective books, which was really nice. And we did that for a while. And then he turned to me and he said, "You know, Papa, I can't really get to sleep at night unless I read first." And I said, "Me too, son." And he said, "That's because when I become an adult, I want to be like you." And I just melted, you know. But then there was a little pause. And he said, "Well, not bald." And then there was another little pause. He said, "Or fat." Now, the reason I tell that story is my son is the king of the one-liner. I mean, he's just brilliant. He just got this incredible sense of timing, and he just has us wound around his little finger every time we try and enter into any kind of debate or argument with him. But on this occasion, he wasn't trying to be a smart-ass. He was actually stating the obvious just in case I didn't get it, because he was aware of my intellectual limitations and the fact that the limits of his desire for emulation was our love of reading, and that was it, nothing more. In many ways, what I'm going to say to you, what I'm going to share with you this afternoon is a bit like what Gian did with me, not because I've got any judgment about your intellectual limitations or otherwise, but because I think it's sometimes very useful. I find it useful to hear the obvious stated, maybe because I take a long time to learn things, and maybe because it's so easy to forget the things that are screamingly obvious, because in most respects, that's what we're up against, is this giant battle to be able to tell the obvious, to state the obvious. And really, the obvious that I'm referring to is a very simple dictum that a good society is one that does not humiliate its members. It's as simple as that. And the way we learn that is from the people who end up being excluded systematically, end up being humiliated, end up being pushed to the margins, because the truth told by the people on the margins is always louder than the lies told about them. I'm going to share with you 3 quotes now, and you have a think about how obvious it is that 2 of these are absolutely spot on, and the third is sadly a lie. The first one is from Vivienne Forrester, a French writer. She wrote a book called The Economic Horror back in 1996, and she said, "The battle is brewing against the excluded. They really take up too much space. They are not excluded nearly enough." The next one comes from a woman who wrote to me recently in the wake of the change pushing around 80,000 single parents onto the lower Newstart allowance. She wrote, "I am a sole parent after the death of my partner in a motorbike fatality. I've been raising our son for the past 13 years on my own. This has been a huge effort on the pension. January, I lost $137 a fortnight. We are struggling bad. At times I feel we may go under. I'm constantly stressed due to the health issues. It's hard for me to find work. My heart goes out to all parents struggling at the moment. I fear for our future. I've given up meat, unaffordable. We have no social outings, and I can't remember the last time I had a bowl of fruit on the table." Third quote comes from the aforementioned Mark Latham in his recently published quarterly essay. And he wrote, "The problem of the underclass is an inability to make good choices." I put it to you that the problem in Australia is not any inability to make good choices by any purported underclass. Our problem is not the idleness of the poor, so as it is often claimed. Our problem, pure and simple, is inequality. And this is a social question. It's not a question of behaviour. We do irreparable harm when we turn it into a question of individual behaviour, and sadly there's a political consensus between both sides of politics that tends to do that. People are blamed for their own exclusion. It's a matter of deep shame that a wealthy nation like ours has kept our unemployment benefits deliberately low as a means of humiliating the very people they were originally designed to assist. Charities like Vinnie's will be there to give people a helping hand, but the fact remains, what people want, what people need is not charity, it's justice. And it is a means of further humiliating people by forcing them to rely on charity. We support people being assisted into the paid workforce, but the time has come to abandon the foolish notion that forcing people into deeper poverty can somehow improve their chances of employment. You don't build people up by putting them down. You don't help someone into work by forcing them more deeply into poverty. The greatest power for progressive social change lies precisely with the people who experience exclusion, for whom it is the bread and butter of everyday life. The people who can best define and interpret the reality of exclusion and socio-economic insecurity are also, I believe, the only ones who can in the end determine both the means towards and the ends of any program for social inclusion. I want to reflect with you today not on how the powers above need to better control, corral, coerce or cajole the people who live at the rough end of Struggle Street, and I have no interest in improving the blunt tools and sharp weapons such as compulsory income management that are brought out to decide from above how to improve the lives of the people who live below. Rather, I want us to think together on how best the reality of exclusion might intrude into our own thinking, just as it intrudes into the all-too-neat packaging of the all-too unjust and unequal consumerist society. For me, the way I looked at the world changed forever when I first read Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and great theorist of the confluence between colonisation of land and the crushing of the human spirit. He consciously opted into the struggle for social justice. He didn't hide behind his science. Rather, in fidelity to the pursuit of objective reality, he took sides with the people he understood to be crushed and silenced. He identified both the enormity of the problem and the specificity of the solution. He wrote back in around 1961, "What counts today, the question that is looming on the horizon, is the need for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity must reply to this question or be shaken to pieces by it." I would add to that along with a redistribution of wealth, we need to actively engage in a massive redistribution of hope. Fanon wrote eloquently about the systematic negation of the other person and the furious determination to deny the other person all attributes of humanity. I want to say a few things about this negation. I want to reflect with you about the people who are made to feel as if they are nothing. You know the people I mean. They often populate our local courts, our emergency rooms in hospitals, the people who are considered to be nobody, of no value. They are made to feel they are constructed as being socially nothing. It's offensive to think of someone as socially nothing. It's offensive because by naming that process for what it is, we strip the veneer away from a society that does not wish to admit that it renders whole groups of people into this condition of social nothingness. Being socially nothing means being not seen as a member of society, as being residual somehow. It means being seen only as a threat, as is very clearly and overtly the case with asylum seekers. The dominant story in Australia today appears to be that people legitimately seeking asylum in our country are a threat, either to our way of life or to our national security. The people are constructed as being socially nothing. Our history since colonisation has not only accepted exclusion, it has enshrined it as structure, as attitude, as instrumental practice. Rather than institutionalising exclusion, it is time, however, to get ready for and time to embrace the intrusion of the excluded as the agents of radical social change. Slavoj Žižek, the maverick Slovenian philosopher you might have seen on Q&A from time to time, poking his pencil into Tony Jones's guts, famously spoke about the ancient Greeks having a word for what they felt was the intrusion of the excluded into the socio-political domain, and that word was democracy. You're well aware of the disproportionate rate of incarceration of Aboriginal adults and young people in this country because, of course, being locked up follows hot on the heels of being locked out. I'm reminded of the poem by Jack Davis, which I find very hard to read, but I wish to share with you, on the death in custody of 16-year-old John Pat in 1983. He writes of the dangerous power of Gadya, or whitefella law. Right of life, the pious said, forget the past is dead. But all I see in front of me is a concrete floor, a cell door, and John Pat. Tear out the page, forget his age. Thin skull, they cried. That's why he died, but I can't forget the silhouette of a concrete floor, a cell door, and John Pat. The end product of Gadya law is a viaduct for fang and claw, and a place to dwell like Roburn's hell of a concrete floor, a cell door, and John Pat. He's there. Where? There in our minds now, deep within, there to prance, a sidelong glance, a silly grin, to remind them all of a Gadya wall, a concrete floor, a cell door, and John Pat. Rather than being listened to, the downtrodden in the prosperous countries of the world are being trodden on even more. Their futures are determined from above. They're told from above what is good for them, how they must improve, how they must change. Feminist writer Carol Harnish wrote a now famous essay in 1969 entitled "The Personal is Political." These words became one of the most important insights, not just for the women's liberation movement, but for all who are committed to progressive social justice and social change. Changing the world is as deeply personal as it is broadly collective. I've had the joy of knowing many, many women and men who engage in this daily practice of learning the art of gentle revolution, to use Lunig's beautiful coinage. I love listening to their stories and watching them at work on their oft disparaged project of building a new society. Sometimes it means helping people climb the walls that are built around them and scaling those walls, but never forgetting that there's no point in just scaling those walls unless we tear the damn things down, even if it's just one brick at a time. The political is at the heart of the concrete conditions in which a person lives. Our lives are bound by economic, social and legislative structures, but then the analysis of these conditions gives rise to a deeply personal commitment to change them, because we feel that whatever is happening to people who are being pushed out, we have a stake in that, and we have an obligation to stand in solidarity with the people who are suffering the effects of exclusion. There are little rays of hope all over the place, and we should never fear. We don't have the right to afford the luxury of despair or pessimism, I believe, and I say that because everyone's looking a bit serious. I remember a few years back, it was during one of the Howard era iterations of so-called welfare reform. Funnily enough, it also was designed to deal a blow to people who were sole parents. And I was sent out to criticise it, of course, and say what I had to say against it. And I remember I had to do a lot of media at the time. There was a lot of interest why the St Vincent de Paul Society would be opposing the government's wonderful intentions of helping people by making life harder for them. And due to my own deeply flawed subjective view of what to expect from different media outlets. I'd done some of the shock jocks and knew what to expect there, but then I stupidly, naively had an interview with an ABC radio station and thought, they'll go a bit softer, They'll be a little bit more sympathetic. Stupid, John. So it was a really robust exchange. And the interviewer absolutely took the government's line and was absolutely attacking me. It was great. I loved every minute of it. I really enjoy a good stoush, but she was going, so, John, the St Vincent de Paul Society wants single mothers to sit on their backsides at home and get money for nothing instead of getting them to go out and work and be a good example to their children. Is that what you want? And I thought, mate, game on here. This is really good. Anyway, we got to the end of the interview and she said to me, John, you're still there? And I said, yeah. And she said, John, we're off air now, but I just need to say to you that the ABC needs to be completely impartial. And I said, thank you. I really do appreciate that. And she said, but John, between ourselves, I'm a single mum myself and I reckon this legislation sucks big time. Go Vinnies. The women and men who are not listened to, even though they're not listened to, they still have their stories, as you know only too well. They still carry the knowledge, and it's rarely privileged as knowledge, it's rarely respected as knowledge, but they carry the knowledge of what has happened, what is happening, and what needs to happen. The dominant discourse tends to ask the question, what is wrong with you? But the real question that needs to be posed and is posed from the grassroots is what has happened to us. Big difference. One tries to construct a behavioural disorder, a dysfunctionality, a pathologising or a criminalising of the individual or of the community or of the cohort. The other seeks a genuinely historical and structural perspective. Another kind of world is possible because the truth that is told by those who live on the margins is the only truth that is worth listening to. If we look a bit closer, we'll actually see that the margins are not that marginal. They're actually right at the heart of society. It just depends on where you stand and whether our eyes are open. The poverty that is experienced by people is a form of oppression. It's not bad luck, it's not bad choice, it is something done to, historically and structurally. I believe that we're bound to join in that struggle for liberation even when our efforts seem paltry and inadequate. In the words of the Honduran poet Roberto Sosa, together we can construct with all our songs a bridge to dignity so that one by one the humiliated of the earth may pass. Whether we're thinking of people who are excluded because of their marginal attachment to the labour market, their gender, their cultural or linguistic background, the social relations in which their disability is constructed, or their Aboriginality, social exclusion is a structural symptom rather than the effect of personal choice or personal deficit. That this is the concrete reality that must intrude into our thinking and our practice if we want a society that is built on the premise of egalitarianism rather than the manufacture of profit. I have to be careful when I speak that way. Soon after working for the St Vincent de Paul Society in 2001, I was outed by that highly esteemed academic journal, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, as I was outed as being evidence of the communist control of the St Vincent de Paul Society. Michael Duffy wrote a piece which began, "Comrade Falzon has been reading more Das Kapital than the Bible," which gave us the opportunity to quote the beautiful words from Helder Câmara, the Brazilian archbishop, who famously said, "When I give bread to the poor, I'm called a saint, but when I ask why they have no bread, I'm called a communist." But since I've been outed as a Marxist, I'll quote Marx for you, because I think he well sums up the political climate in many respects. He said, Groucho I'm talking about, of course, he famously said, "These are my principles, but if you don't like them, I have others." Back in 1996, God help me, I was working full-time on my doctoral thesis and living in Liverpool on the outskirts, the southwestern outskirts of Sydney with my partner. And I remember I was sitting on the porch of our flat one afternoon because all the reading had done my head in. And I was having a break, taking a quiet smoke, as I did in those days, trying to digest what I'd been reading. And just at that moment, a woman and a man walked by. No, it's not a PJ Harvey song, I'm quoting him. The man was a few steps ahead of the woman, and he was yelling at the top of his voice. And he yelled out these words, and they stuck with me because they crystallised all that I'd been trying to struggle with in what I was researching. He yelled out, "I know people, I've been to the factory where they're made." And I thought, man, that is good stuff. That is really so true. So I ran inside and I stole the words, of course. I mean, you know, being a very unethical scholar, I didn't go and ask him written permission to use them. I'm not claiming them as my own, at least, I'm being that honest. But I just thought the factory where they're made, or unmade for that matter, the factory where we're unmade. I thought of the people I'd known, starting with my own old man who was unmade in the factory. In his case, he got cancer from having to use solvents when he was working at Boral on road materials. But how many stories do we hear every day of people who are physically or spiritually or economically, socially, politically unmade in their day-to-day existence by the factory, so to speak? People made and then pulled apart by social and economic structures that dehumanise, that compartmentalise, that destroy, that humiliate, that blame. People made to feel that their lives are worth very little, that their position at the bottom of the heap completely excludes and effectively disempowers them, and that they deserve it, that they brought it on themselves. As far as the intersection between the law and people experiencing exclusion is concerned, it's often as if people are being systematically prepared or made for a series of collisions with state instrumentalities of surveillance, control, coercion, and sometimes, of course, ultimately incarceration. As one solicitor working primarily on legal aid cases told me recently, I love being able to offer some advocacy for the people who've had no one to advocate for them. The tragedy is that the first time they're offered some advocacy is because they've fallen foul of the law. The law, of course, develops as a reflection of social relations in a given society within its given economic formation. We do well to remember the anonymous piece of doggerel from 15th century England at the time of the enclosure laws that were being felt, especially by people who were very vulnerable, depending on those commons to collect wood and to hunt small animals and so forth. The piece of doggerel goes, and I believe it's just as pertinent today as then. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the bigger villain loose who steals the common from under the goose. The law does indeed continue to lock up the man or woman who's more likely to be from a disadvantaged background, often starting them on their bleak journey as juveniles. It's no surprise that incarceration often begets even more incarceration rather than even a notional rehabilitation or support. Quite the contrary, the people who've been pushed to the margins, locked out, are either pathologised or criminalised. In either case, they're always problematised. Professor John McKnight, with whom I don't agree on many things, put very beautifully this phrase, revolutions begin when people who are defined as problems achieve the power to redefine the problem. There's often this incredible presumption that people are incapable of analysing their own situation, and this presumption carries with it a handy rejection of the notion of actually providing resources to people to allow them to articulate their analyses and proposed solutions. And yet, under the guiding stars of struggle and hope, the greatest social reforms in Australia have always been wrought by grassroots movements. As the German poet Bertolt Brecht put it, the compassion of the oppressed for the oppressed is indispensable. It is the world's one hope. But you think about it historically, no matter what the social policy textbooks tell you, without the organised analysis and agitation of people on the ground, we would never have seen the gains that we have made as a nation in the areas of industrial rights, women's rights, the establishment and public funding of refuges for women and young people, tenants' rights, environmental justice, workers' comp, Aboriginal citizenship rights, the list goes on. Everything that has been of any value in terms of social progress has been fought for from below. It was never delivered from above. It might have been formulated and legislated from above, but that was in response to agitation from below. And you think about the years of the Great Depression, when people gathered round the homes of working families who were about to be evicted, and they fought back the police that were sent to carry out the law, of course. And here we saw the beginning of the conceptualisation of housing as a human right. We've got a hell of a long way to go, of course. But it's a very dangerous, you're looking a bit serious again here, so it's a very dangerous area to be involved in. Once you embrace that conceptual framework that social justice can only really be achieved from below, it really changes the way you think about everything. I remember getting into big trouble, again in my family context, over this. Some years ago, we had a family meeting. My partner Jackie wanted to, because we're such ideal parents, she wanted to confront the children in a very adult and logical way about some of their things that they were doing wrong. So we're sitting around the table, and Jackie, being the more logical and forthright and articulate one, said, children, Papa and I have a few things we want to discuss with you. And she just listed them. They weren't huge, but, get it out in the open, eh? And our daughter, Gabriella, who was probably about, 11, 12 at the time, listened. My son just stared at the ceiling. He just wanted to be over and just agree, whatever, But Gabriella listened very patiently and then said, thank you, Mama. Are you finished? Because there's a few things I'd like to raise with you that we're not happy about with you and Papa either. And Jackie gave me one of those withering looks from across the table, as if to say, you are so to blame for this. And I sort of said, I thought I'd better, be a man of action here and do something. So I turned to Gabriella and I said, darling, with my tough voice, darling, this isn't a debate, because we often have family debates around it. This isn't a debate. You don't have to win points. We're just talking here and, it's not a fight. You don't need to fight back or anything like that, And then with a glint in her eye and a little smile forming at the corner of her lips, Gabriella, looking at me as if to say, I know you're secretly proud of me, she banged the table and said, I will never stop fighting for our rights as children. So then... knowing that all was lost as far as reasonable discussion was concerned, Jackie had to take immediate action and sent her to her room. And she came out and was willing to negotiate then, but don't tell anyone that, please. The 1975 Commission of Inquiry into Poverty noted that if poverty is seen as the result of structural inequality within society, any serious attempt to eliminate poverty must seek to change the conditions which produce it. It ain't rocket science. It's the obvious that I've just been saying over and over again, and please forgive me for having done so. But then, where do we find within government instrumentalities the courage to do that? It was the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu who spoke of the right hand of the state as the expression of the values and desires of the market, as opposed to what he called the left hand of the state being, I quote, the trace within the state of the social struggles of the past. I think it is that we have to nurture, that we have to cling to, that we have to reignite to find new social struggles, because otherwise the state will never have within it the ability, the knowledge, the desire to bring about progressive social change that is lasting, because it is informed by the experience of people on the ground. At the hands of the market that puts profits before people, people are forced underground. They resurface in our prisons and in our streets. They're forced to hock their furnishings, their personal possessions. They seek consolation in the arms of loan sharks and payday lenders. Charity may well tide them over till their next crisis, but it is justice, only justice, that will fulfil their long-term dreams. Italian political theorist Domenico Losurdo wrote, "Democracy cannot be defined by abstracting the fate of the excluded." In a very Australian crystallisation of the same insight, put in a far more concrete way, I think, the Reverend Dr. Giannini Gondara, referring to the various iterations of the Northern Territory intervention, said, "Inequality cannot be addressed by the removal of control from affected people over their lives and over their land." Let's be clear. You don't build a community by attacking its people's dignity. You don't build a community up by dragging or putting people down, by disempowering and humiliating. You don't create social inclusion by further excluding people and reducing their choices even more, watching over them more, controlling them even more. And so I'll conclude with the beautiful words of Lilla Watson and a group of Aboriginal activists in Queensland in the 1970s who said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Thank you.
And our liberation is all bound together in community. That's what it's about. There's no doubt that exclusion of any diminishes all of us. So thank you, John. That was just a marvellous speech, and just giving us some of the language and passion to articulate what so many of us see day to day in our work. So can we just give John another great... burst of applause. We have time now for some questions and some comments. So we've got the microphones there. If you wave your hands in the air, we'll come to you. John, you reminded me when you were speaking, it's funny how your mind goes back, but I can remember vividly this day when an uncle of mine gave us kids a large cherry ripe, and there were 3 of us, and I was the oldest and the biggest, so I said, yeah, I'll divide it up. And my mother said, yeah, you can divide it up. The one who cuts picks last. It was very evenly divided. Would be an interesting way to distribute hope and opportunity and wealth in any land, I would think. So, do we have some? Do you have questions down in the back corner there? Thank you. Any more? And one, I've got the second one over there and a third one there. Thank you.
Hi, yep. Chris Milne from Gippsland. I'm just, thank you for your talk there, but I was just wondering where you thought change, I guess, coming to think the way you are thinking in terms of, shifting the power and, I guess, empowering people to, not bringing people down, sorry. Where you think that sort of first domino is essentially, where are we going to make the change?
Anyone know the answer? Yeah, 'cause, I think, in a way, as the French philosopher Alain Badiou speaks about this eruption of this dream of the commons from any possible crevices or gaps within the social and economic structure. And I think that's what we've really got to be sensitive to and not be dismissive of. So, for example, the labour movement in Australia was traditionally very male-dominated and very... it marginalised so-called women's issues, and I think that's why we still are living with a false division between labour rights and so-called welfare rights, and why we can have a Prime Minister who will say, I'm on the side of the people who get up in the morning, set the clock and get to work, but I'm not going to give an increase to the people who don't. So in any movement, even a good social movement, I think we have to be very careful of being blind to those little eruptions, those little gaps, those chasms that form within society, reminding us of some form of inequality, and realising that the solution, even though it's going to very gradually emerge, lies only within the guts of the problem. So rather than starting with the premise that, I've got a brilliant policy solution here, how do I prosecute that and advocate for it, starting very uncomfortably from the guts of the problem. That's my response, uncertain and inconclusive as it is.
I've got a second one, John, right over on your right.
Thanks, John. Obviously you don't have a problem speaking truth to power, but has it come back to bite you at times? And is there a bit of nuance sometimes? Is there a bit of a line that you won't cross? Or
So you're talking about, for instance, backlash from government for being critical. I've been really fortunate being with Vinnie's and having the support of our National Council when we've done that. And there will always be people within your organisation who will say, be careful there. And you'll also always going to cop nasty letters, from members of the public. I mean, it's amazing the things that trigger a really negative response. It's very interesting, the kind of things that really, really upset people, whether it's speaking up on behalf of unemployed people or single mums or asylum seekers, queue jumpers. I'm not going to give any money to Vinnies if you're going to support these people, or anything at all. It comes up a lot of racism, stance on stronger futures, and the intervention, same thing. So yeah, there will always be repercussions. And I think, whilst you've got to be sensible and you've never should personalise the criticism, I don't believe that's very useful in terms of social progress. I've always felt that we have a really deep obligation to convey what has been conveyed to us. Otherwise we're lying if we're not telling the truth. But yes, it does come back and bite you. And that first time that I mentioned about when I was outed as a communist, I really thought that was the end of my job, and I offered my resignation to the then national president. But it was an amazing thing. It actually galvanised the feeling of resistance within the organisation, and people were feeling a sense of, hey, we're not going to be silenced, even though the people that we're working with are effectively silenced. So I'll leave that for you to ponder and decide what works for you.
In the middle, down towards the back, John.
Oh, thanks, John. Thanks very much for the very passionate discussion you're provoking today. Just regarding the sole parent payment, and you mentioned the distribution of wealth. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and Tim Costello made the comment that people are having fewer kids, living in bigger houses, and one of the biggest growth areas is storage. I guess pointing to the fact that we're consuming more than we know what to do with. More recently, there's been some discussion around household incomes and what constitutes being wealthy and well off. And while the cost of housing is certainly a big player, I guess I want to ask is what needs to happen to recalibrate the broader community's perception of being financially wealthy and well off when governments keep telling us how bad we seem to have it and what they'll do to fix it. Thinking about the middle class, how do we then I guess get this middle class to look further than their own fence and their own bank balance to see those people who are genuinely struggling in these conditions that you discuss?
Oh, geez, you ask me all these really hard questions. I mean, it's easy giving the speech. I just, have these cheat notes and everything, and then you ask me these tough questions. I don't know the answer to, how that is achieved. All I can say is the only thing I have found that works is trying to find areas of commonality, rather than trying to elicit a sense of sympathy, which I think is very limited and ends up being morally redundant. I know that sounds very strange on the lips of someone who's representing a charity, but in the long term, sympathy that is directed from above has a very, very limited use value in the scheme of things. But finding an area of common desire and common passion for change, I think that's the area in which people can really feel a sense of wanting to join forces. Going back to that beautiful quote from Lilla Watson, if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, not because you feel sorry for me and you want to achieve from above my liberation, but you have exactly the same stake in this. Your liberation is bound up with mine. And so what we need to uncover and really reveal are the false wedges, because they abound in plenty and they're imposed by the dominant discourse. So, for instance, when the Northern Territory intervention occurred, and it was just Aboriginal people that were copying these absolutely paternalistic forms of coercion and control. So that was just Aboriginal people, so it didn't really matter to non-Aboriginal people. And then lo and behold, these terrible forms of internal colonisation were shamelessly trialled on the First Peoples, but then rolled out to non-Indigenous peoples who are similarly colonised in so-called postcodes of disadvantage, because by that terrible logic, extension of logic, that perverted logic, that these are people that should be subjugated and controlled. And then all of a sudden, we're starting with the Northern Territory in order to cynically get around the reinstatement of the Racial Discrimination Act, compulsory income management's extended to non-Indigenous people and certain social security benefits. So it's imposition by means of class discrimination, which always carries within it race discrimination. You don't escape it. So you've got to find those areas of commonality and really go hard with them. And that's a really a hard road of self-education, collective self-education and listening.
Okay, we have our last two. I have one down there by the door and then one right up here up the front. So.
Thank you for that speech. It was really moving for me. My name's Isabel Mannix and I'm a student from Bendigo Senior Secondary College. My concern is youth are growingly influenced by the Australian media, of which influence emphasises Miss Gillard and Mr Abbott and their respective parties' views on disadvantaged people. This comes across to youth and to myself as what you described in your address as unprogressive and hopeless. From your perspective, what can youth do to change the generational influence and attitude to disadvantaged people so my generation does not continue this unfair stigma?
Another bloody hard one. Bloody young people who let them in. Thank you very much. It's a very powerful question, and the expression of applause speaks volumes about how it just cuts to the very heart of why we're all here today. I think the advantage. I'm really thinking on my feet here. The advantage that young people have is not being shackled by some of those older social forms of organisation. Marx, not Groucho, his brother Karl, actually did say, was it the old, he put it very beautifully, in Das Kapital, which I did read after being told that I must have read it. I said, I better read it. I'd never read it before. And he wrote, new forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society, but the old forms of social organisation seeks to fetter them and keep them down. So it's a very powerful quote in a very turgid book on political economy. But it really sums up to me what the hopes are, particularly from the new forms of social organisation that can be generated by younger generations. With the new passions, with the new senses of, what is fair, that questioning attitude, which I think is really useful. Sadly, we have these old forms of social organisation that do fetter and keep down. My daughter, who I mentioned earlier, she's 16 now, and she decided she would join Young Labor. I'm not making a judgment here for or against or anything like that. She said to me, can you put me in touch with Young Labor, and I'd be interested in being part of some structured political debate. I said, yeah, sure, no worries. And she said, and can you make sure that I'm put with the left? And I said, yeah, no worries, I'll do that too. Anyway, I did, and she came back from her first meeting. She goes, oh man, it was like two parties, like she said, the left, we were this little rump at the end of the table, and we're all dishevelled and everything, and lucky I wore my Aboriginal flag T-shirt, because that way the right didn't try to approach me, and that's what I was told. And she said, and the right were all young men in designer jeans, button-down shirts, studying economics, law, and defending the police use of tasers. And So she went to the second message. She said, I'm so annoyed, the left, though, you know, they're great people, but they're so disorganised. She said, I'm going to write a resolution. They just scribble something in an exercise book and then tear it out and hand it in, and the right are so organised, you know. So she prepared a resolution on the rates of incarceration of women and the need for diversionary programs. And I said, no, you need an economic imperative, otherwise the right will never vote for it. You know, they're not interested in ethics. And blow me down, she got the resolution up. Didn't change anything as far as the ACT law was concerned, but you know, it was brave, I thought, because it was. I don't think she'll necessarily stick around there, but she was willing to go into an old structure and try and subvert it from within, and I think that's often where you've got to start.
John, we've got one here, and then we do have one on the table right in front of you, and then that will have to be it because we're crossing live to the UK.
John, Ross Mark, Creativity Australia. Thank you very much for that. It was a great presentation. Question I had is coming to the end of your presentation, speaking about control, and we can't, you know, help by controlling. And I was wondering if you had any observations, I guess, on the trend in government and government policy towards trying to control outcomes in social issues and the challenges we probably all face in the programs we're developing, in that you can't put these really rigid controls in place and hope to get outcomes, yet that's what government is increasingly trying to do. And in the UK, it's gone that way, and there's a whole heap of examples where the trend is towards more control.
Just to say very quickly, this, of course, comes from the United States, that framework known as the new paternalism, championed by people such as Lawrence Mead, and it's predicated on the belief that people who are in any form of exclusion, it's because of a moral failing, and they need behaviour change from above, like small children who need a good dose of the stick and maybe every now and then a little carrot. And of course, these forms of control may well produce some behavioural change if you believe in treating people like rats in a maze, but they will never bring about the lasting social change that will deliver any kind of sustainable progress. Even from an economic rationalist perspective of, for instance, the productivity lens, you're not going to solve the problem of this massive surplus pool of labour by simply saying we're going to make you poorer and therefore make you get off your backsides and get a job, because we know in terms of economics that arithmetically it doesn't work that way. So those programs, I think, are more designed for political mileage. It gives the welfare bashers of all political stripes a great deal of pleasure in putting the boot in, but it doesn't deliver any kind of social change whatsoever.
Hi, John. I thought that was real deadly. Thank you. They say perception is reality, and as an Aboriginal person in Australia, I was profoundly saddened by, for me it seemed to be, a conspiracy of silence around the intervention. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Thank you very much. Yep, thank you very much for your question. And you know, you're absolutely right. There was a conspiracy of silence. There continues to be a conspiracy of silence around so many issues affecting the First Peoples of this nation. And I would simply say this, that until I believe that wound, that gaping wound of colonisation, if we think that it's way back in history and it's been resolved and it's time to move on or forget about it or anything, we've got another thing coming. It's the fundamental contradiction within Australian society. And until we face up to that fundamental contradiction, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, we will never be able to bring about lasting social change and deliver this dream of an egalitarian nation.
Well, thank you, John.